Most people talk too much about lives they have not built yet. They explain their plans too early, their decisions too openly, their goals to people who did not earn that level of access. And then they wonder why their energy feels weaker, why their focus starts leaking, why their direction gets polluted the moment other people's opinions enter the room. That is the danger of overexposure. Not everything in your life is meant to be spoken out loud the moment it becomes real to you. Some things lose strength when they are shared too soon. Some things get diluted the moment they are explained. And some parts of your life begin to belong less to you the moment you start offering them up for public reaction, approval, interpretation, and noise. This is one of the hardest lessons people learn too late. They think openness is honesty. They think explaining themselves is maturity. They think constant disclosure makes them authentic. But very often, it does the opposite. It weakens their presence. It scatters their momentum. It makes them more available to judgment, gossip, projection, and interruption. Instead of moving quietly and building something real, they start managing perception. They start defending choices that did not need defense. They start narrating a life they should have been living. Stoicism teaches something very different. Not emotional coldness, not fear of people, not secrecy for the sake of secrecy. It teaches restraint, proportion, inner command. The understanding that peace is easier to protect when not everyone has access to your inner world. The understanding that silence is not emptiness. It is often strength that has stopped performing. So in this episode, I want to walk through 10 Stoic lessons that can completely change the way you use words, attention, boundaries, and silence. Because when you stop explaining your life to everyone, something powerful begins to happen. You stop leaking energy. You stop feeding noise. You stop making your path smaller just because other people are uncomfortable with it. And most importantly, you begin to feel something that is becoming increasingly rare. A life that still belongs to you. The first lesson is this: your life is not for public consumption. That may sound extreme at first, but most people live as if every important part of their life needs to be announced, explained, justified, updated, and made legible to others. They speak too quickly about what they are building, what they're changing, what they're healing from, what they're planning next. And in doing so, they slowly turn their inner life into something public, something available for reaction, commentary, approval, confusion, envy, doubt, and noise. That is a dangerous habit, because the moment your life becomes too available, it becomes easier for other people's opinions to enter places where they do not belong. A private decision becomes a social discussion. A personal goal becomes a performance. A quiet change in direction becomes something you now feel pressure to defend. And once that happens, your energy is no longer fully serving the life itself. Part of it is now serving the audience around it. This is one reason so many people feel scattered. They are not only living, they are narrating. They are not only making decisions, they are pre-explaining them. They are not only moving, they are imagining how that movement will be perceived, questioned, misunderstood, or judged. That is a heavy way to live. It creates internal noise before the real work has even begun. Stoicism pushes against this instinct. It teaches that what matters is not how visible your life looks from the outside, but how governed it is from the inside. You do not owe everyone access to your process. You do not owe the world constant explanation, and you certainly do not owe clarity about every inner shift to people who are not carrying the cost of your choices. Think about how much weaker a decision becomes the moment it is handed to the wrong people too early. You say you are changing careers, and suddenly you are managing doubt that did not exist before. You say you are ending a relationship, and now you are answering questions that make the process heavier than it already was. You say you are working on yourself, and before anything has really formed, you have already invited opinions from people who do not even understand the old version of you, let alone the one trying to emerge. That is what public consumption does. It takes something that should still be protected and makes it available too early. And once other people start reacting to it, you begin feeling pressure that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with exposure. This does not mean you become closed, paranoid, or emotionally unreachable. It means you become selective. It means you stop treating access as free. You stop assuming that because something is meaningful to you, it must be shared immediately. Some parts of life need privacy, not because they are shameful, but because they are still growing. And anything still growing is easier to damage than people like to admit. The strongest lives are often quieter than expected, not because they are empty, but because they are protected. And once you understand that your life is not for public consumption, the next lesson becomes obvious. The more quickly you speak, the more quickly your words start losing power. The second lesson is this: words lose power when they are given too soon. A lot of people do not understand this until they have already weakened something important by talking about it too early. They announce the plan before it has roots. They explain the decision before they have fully lived it. They reveal the intention before it has been tested by action, and what could have stayed strong, quiet, and internally guided becomes exposed to reaction before it has enough weight to withstand it. That is one of the hidden costs of explaining your life too early. The words come out before the work has matured, and when that happens, something subtle changes. The energy that should have gone into building now gets redirected into speaking, into clarifying, into answering questions, into defending, into managing how other people receive what you said. The moment you explain too soon, your attention gets split. Part of you is still trying to move forward. The other part is now trapped in other people's interpretations of that movement. This is why strong people often speak later than expected, not because they are secretive by nature, but because they understand timing. They know that some things become weaker when turned into conversation, before they become reality. A goal sounds exciting when spoken, but speech can create the illusion of progress without the cost of real progress. A decision feels powerful when announced, but once it is exposed too early, it can become vulnerable to doubt, interruption, and pressure. A change in identity may feel fragile at first, and the wrong audience can make that fragility much worse. Think about how often this happens. Someone says they're going to transform their life, start over, build something, leave something, heal something, change something. But the moment they speak it out widely, the inner force begins to leak. Now, it is not just theirs anymore. It is public language, public reaction, public energy. And instead of quietly becoming, they begin talking about becoming. That is not harmless. Words are powerful when they are backed by timing, restraint, and action. But when they come too early, they stop serving the life and start replacing it. You begin feeling the emotional reward of expression before earning the stability of results. That is why some people speak beautifully about futures they never enter. The words came first. The reality never caught up. Stoicism does not ask you to become mute. It asks you to become disciplined, to understand that not every insight needs immediate expression, not every plan needs an audience, not every internal shift needs to be turned into language while it is still fragile. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let your life hold the meaning before your mouth tries to explain it. Because once your words become too available, they also become cheaper. The more often you explain yourself, announce yourself, and narrate yourself, the less weight your words carry. But when speech becomes rarer, more deliberate, more earned, it changes its character. It starts sounding like something built from self-command rather than emotional overflow. And once you understand that, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Your words are not the only thing you leak when you over-explain. You also leak attention, and attention is far too valuable to spend carelessly. The third lesson is this: attention is a currency, so stop wasting it. Most people think they are only losing words when they explain too much. They are not. They are losing attention. And attention is one of the most valuable things a person has. It decides what grows in your life, what stays weak, what gets built, what gets delayed, and what quietly dies from neglect. Whatever keeps receiving your attention keeps receiving your life. That is why over-explaining is so expensive. The moment you start telling everyone what you are doing, why you are doing it, how you feel about it, what changed, what your intention is, and why they should understand it, your focus begins to scatter. Now, part of your energy is no longer going into the work, the healing, the decision, or the direction itself. It is going into people's reactions, their opinions, their confusion, their approval, their doubt, their curiosity, their unnecessary access. That is a bad trade, because attention works like money. If you keep spending small amounts carelessly, you eventually become poor without understanding why. One conversation here, one explanation there, one emotional update to the wrong person, one long defense of a decision that never needed defense. None of these moments feels massive on its own, but together they drain force from your life. The energy that should have stayed concentrated becomes thin, divided, and easier to interrupt. This is one reason some people never seem to build momentum. They are always available. Available to texts, to opinions, to gossip, to reactions, to being pulled into conversations that do not move their life forward at all. They do not guard their attention, so their attention gets consumed by anything loud enough to ask for it. Then later, they say they feel tired, unfocused, mentally crowded, or emotionally scattered. Of course they do. Their attention is leaking in 10 directions at once. Stoicism teaches a harder lesson than people expect here. Not everything deserves your mind. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every person deserves a full explanation. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Sometimes peace is not built by doing more. It is built by refusing to keep paying attention to what has not earned it. Think about how much stronger your life becomes when your attention is no longer publicly available. When fewer people have access to your internal process. When fewer conversations get to touch what you're building. When fewer outside voices are allowed to sit inside your mind after the interaction is over. That is not isolation. That is discipline. It is understanding that your attention has weight, and anything with weight must be guarded. Because once you learn to treat attention like currency, you stop giving it away just to keep people comfortable. And that naturally leads to the next lesson. If attention is valuable, then access has to be limited, which means boundaries are no longer optional. The fourth lesson is this: boundaries decide who gets access. A lot of people keep explaining their lives because they never made a real decision about access. They have opinions about privacy, but no structure around it. They say they want peace, but they leave the door open to people who question everything, probe too deeply, gossip carelessly, or treat personal information like social material. Then they wonder why they feel exposed, interrupted, and mentally crowded. This is what happens when boundaries are weak. Access becomes accidental, and accidental access always becomes expensive, because the more people can enter your inner world without earning it, the more often you will feel pressure to explain yourself, to justify decisions, to soften choices, to clarify intentions that should have been allowed to stand on their own. What looks like over-explaining is often just the consequence of unclear boundaries. If you never decided who gets to know what, everyone starts acting as if they deserve more than they do. That is why boundaries matter so much here. They do not just protect your time, they protect your interior. They decide who gets details, who gets summaries, who gets silence, and who gets nothing at all. And that is not cruelty. It is proportion. Not everyone has the same relationship to your life, so not everyone should have the same level of access to it. Think about how often people confuse openness with maturity. They assume that being emotionally healthy means being available, transparent, easy to read, willing to explain, willing to reassure, willing to let everyone in so no one feels shut out. But that is not maturity. Sometimes it is just fear of disappointing people, fear of seeming distant, fear of being misunderstood. So instead of holding a clean line, they keep talking. Strong boundaries end that pattern. They let you say, "This part of my life is not up for discussion. This decision does not require a panel. This process is still private. This relationship does not give you unlimited access to my mind. This is not something I owe you detail about." Those are powerful inner decisions, even when they are never spoken out loud, because once you are clear about access, your speech changes naturally. You stop leaking information just because someone is curious. You stop mistaking questions for entitlement. And boundaries also reveal something uncomfortable but necessary. Many people do not actually want all of you. They want the version of you that stays easy for them to understand, predict, or manage. The moment you stop over-explaining, they may act confused, offended, or distant, not because you became wrong, but because access changed. And weak relationships often react badly when access is no longer unlimited. That is useful information, because boundaries do not just protect your peace, they show you who respected your life and who merely enjoyed unrestricted entry into it. And once you see that clearly, another lesson becomes even more important. If access is not guarded, then momentum gets damaged, because what you are building cannot stay strong if too many people keep touching it too early. The fifth lesson is this: your momentum is yours, so protect it. Most people underestimate how fragile momentum can be in the early stages of anything meaningful. A new discipline, a new routine, a new direction, a new identity, a private commitment to change. In the beginning, it often does not look dramatic. It looks quiet, repetitive, unimpressive. It is still finding its own shape. And that is exactly why it needs protection. Because momentum is not just about action, it is about continuity without interference. The moment too many people enter what you are building, they start changing the emotional climate around it. Some will doubt it, some will question it, some will joke about it, some will ask for updates before anything has had time to grow. Some will pull you into explanations that make the thing feel heavier than it was when it was still yours alone. And even when they mean no harm, their attention can still disturb the rhythm. That is what many people never learn. It is not only negativity that breaks momentum, it is exposure. A quiet process can become unstable the moment it becomes social. This is why people often lose force right after they talk too much about what they are about to do. A plan that felt clean becomes performative. A routine that felt personal becomes something to report on. A private standard becomes an identity to defend. Now, instead of simply doing the work, they are half living it and half managing how it looks from the outside. That split is enough to weaken consistency very quickly. Stoicism has no interest in that kind of leakage. It respects the person who keeps moving whether anyone is watching or not. The person who protects the early stages of growth from unnecessary commentary. The person who understands that something does not become more real because it is more visible. In many cases, it becomes more vulnerable. Think about how many things would have stayed stronger if they had been allowed to remain quiet a little longer. A health change that got mocked before it became stable. A personal boundary that was debated before it was fully internalized. A creative direction that got diluted by too much outside opinion. A private recovery that became harder because too many people were invited into it before it could stand on its own. All of these are examples of momentum being touched too soon, and the cost is not always immediate. Sometimes the process still continues, but with less purity, less force, less inner certainty. That is the hidden damage. Not total collapse, but quiet weakening. The work still exists, but now it has to fight through voices that never should have been inside it. So protecting momentum means learning when not to speak, when not to update, when not to clarify, when not to turn your direction into a conversation. It means understanding that consistency often grows best in silence, because silence reduces interference. It keeps the process close to the source. And once you learn to guard momentum that way, another trap becomes easier to avoid, because one of the fastest ways people lose force is not only through overexposure, it is through gossip, through letting their energy become part of a system that never builds anything and always consumes. The sixth lesson is this: gossip is a system, so do not feed it. Most people think gossip is just casual conversation that went a little too far. It is not. Gossip is a system. It is a way people regulate status, control narratives, test loyalties, pass boredom around, and create artificial closeness by making someone else emotionally available in their absence. And the moment you start feeding that system, you make your own life more vulnerable to it. Because the person who constantly consumes other people's private lives is usually not developing the discipline to respect yours. This is why over-explaining and gossip often travel together. The more you normalize loose conversation about what is personal, fragile, or still forming, the more likely it becomes that your own process will eventually be treated the same way. Maybe not maliciously, maybe not dramatically, but casually. And casual exposure can damage a life just as much as intentional betrayal when what is being exposed should still have been protected. Gossip also does something more subtle. It trains your mind in the wrong direction. It teaches you to live outward, to stay preoccupied with perception, reaction, and the social meaning of things. Instead of building your own life, you become someone who keeps mentally orbiting other people's choices, flaws, relationships, failures, and secrets. That is a terrible use of attention. It weakens seriousness. It scatters force. And it creates an environment where silence starts feeling unnatural, even though silence is often what protects clarity. Think about how many conversations are built on nothing of value. Replaying what someone said, guessing what someone meant, passing around details that do not belong to you, turning another person's vulnerability into social material. It may feel small in the moment. It may even feel normal, but it slowly lowers the standard of your inner world. It makes you more careless with attention, more careless with words, and eventually more careless with what should remain sacred. Stoicism cuts against that completely. It asks a harder question. Does this conversation build anything real? Does it sharpen judgment, improve character, clarify truth, or strengthen peace? If not, why is it getting your mind? Why is it getting your language? Why is it being fed? This matters because once you stop feeding gossip, two things happen. First, you stop leaking your own energy into a system that rewards noise over substance. Second, you become more trustworthy to yourself. You stop making your speech cheap. You stop normalizing access where access has not been earned. You stop participating in the kind of atmosphere that eventually makes everyone feel exposed and no one feels safe. And that choice changes more than people expect, because when you stop feeding gossip, you also stop feeding the version of social life that depends on predictability, performance, and constant visibility. And that brings you to an uncomfortable truth. A lot of people do not actually want the real version of you. They want the version they can predict. The seventh lesson is this: most people prefer the predictable version of you, not the truest version, not the growing version, not the private version that is changing faster than language can explain. The predictable version, the one they already understand, the one that fits the role they assign to you, the one that keeps their relationship with you comfortable, stable, and easy to interpret. This is one reason people become so uncomfortable when you stop explaining yourself, because explanation helps other people keep you organized in their minds. It helps them feel informed, in control, included. It reassures them that the version of you they know is still the one they can expect. But the moment you become quieter, more private, less available for constant explanation, something shifts. Now they have to tolerate uncertainty. Now they have to face the fact that you may be changing in ways that do not center their understanding. And a lot of people do not like that. That discomfort tells you something important. It tells you that some relationships were never as open-minded as they seemed. They were simply stable as long as you remained familiar, as long as you kept offering context, updates, reassurance, and continuity. As long as you kept helping other people adjust to every shift in your life. But real freedom begins when you stop making your evolution dependent on everyone else's comfort. Think about how often people subtly resist change, not because the change is wrong, but because it makes you less predictable. You become quieter, and they call you distant. You set a boundary, and they call you cold. You stop oversharing, and they act as if something is wrong. You stop asking for approval, and suddenly they seem less warm. None of this necessarily means they are evil, but it does reveal something. Many people are attached less to your truth than to their version of you. That is why explaining your life too much can become a trap. It keeps reinforcing the old map. It keeps reassuring everyone that they still know exactly who you are, what you mean, what you're doing, and where you stand. But sometimes growth requires becoming less legible for a while, less easy to summarize, less easy to place inside other people's expectations. Stoicism respects that kind of inner independence. It does not ask you to be confusing for the sake of mystery. It asks you to stop letting your life be governed by the need to remain easy for others to digest. There is a deep strength in allowing people to be uncertain about you while you remain certain about yourself. Because certainty inside matters more than predictability outside. And once you accept that many people prefer the version of you they can predict, another lesson starts to deepen. Silence is not just a social tactic. It is a discipline, a form of training, something that shapes the self from within. The 8th lesson is this: silence is training, not emptiness. Most people think silence means absence, absence of speech, absence of expression, absence of engagement. They imagine that if they are not explaining, reacting, updating, or clarifying, then nothing is happening. But in reality, silence is often where the most important inner work takes place. It is where impulse meets restraint, where ego meets discipline, where the need to be understood meets the strength to remain unperformed. That is why silence is not passive. It is active self-command. Every time you choose not to explain something that does not need explanation, you are training your mind to tolerate misinterpretation without panic. Every time you choose not to answer a probing question with more access than it deserves, you are training your boundaries. Every time you let a misunderstanding exist without rushing to correct it for the sake of your image, you are strengthening something deeper than reputation. You are strengthening inner steadiness. That kind of training matters because most people are not disturbed by silence itself. They are disturbed by what silence forces them to face. Uncertainty, lack of control, the loss of performance. The fact that not everything can be managed through words. The fact that they may not be seen correctly by everyone and may have to survive that without explanation. That is where silence becomes difficult, not because it is empty, but because it reveals dependency. Dependency on being known, approved, validated, interpreted correctly, kept in good standing, emotionally visible at all times. And if you have lived too long in that dependency, silence can feel like losing ground. But it is actually the opposite. It is the place where you stop giving that ground away. Think about how many people speak, not because truth needs language, but because anxiety wants relief. They over-explain because they cannot tolerate being questioned. They keep talking because they cannot bear to be misunderstood. They narrate themselves because they do not know how to remain solid without external confirmation. In all these cases, speech is not freedom. It is compensation. Silence breaks that pattern. It forces you to build internal certainty instead of borrowing it from conversation. It teaches you to let your life stand without constant verbal scaffolding. It teaches you to move without always being mirrored back by other people's understanding. And that is not a small thing. It changes your whole emotional structure. You become less available to social pressure, less exposed to noise, less dependent on being explained into legitimacy. Stoicism understands this well. It does not praise silence because silence looks wise. It praises silence because silence reveals governance. It shows that your words are no longer the immediate servants of your discomfort. It shows that you can carry your reality without needing to constantly externalize it. And once silence becomes training instead of emptiness, another truth follows naturally. Not everyone deserves to hear your truth. Because truth without discernment is not honesty. It is exposure. The 9th lesson is this: not everyone deserves access to your truth. This is where a lot of people confuse honesty with exposure. They think that if something is true, it should be speakable to anyone who asks, anyone who is close, or anyone who seems interested. But truth is not just about content. It is also about context, timing, character, trust. Some truths are not weakened because they are false. They are weakened because they are placed in the wrong hands. That is what many people learn too late. They share something real, vulnerable, meaningful, still forming, and instead of being met with care, they are met with curiosity, projection, gossip, judgment, advice they did not ask for, or reactions that make the truth feel smaller than it was before it was spoken. Then they walk away feeling strangely diminished, not because the truth was wrong, but because discernment was missing. Not everyone knows how to hold what is real. Some people only know how to interpret. Some only know how to compare. Some only know how to turn your honesty into social material, emotional leverage, or subtle control. And some are simply too shallow, too reactive, or too immature to be given access to parts of you that still need clean air around them. That is not cruelty. It is proportion. A lot of over-explaining begins with the fantasy that if you just tell the truth clearly enough, the right people will understand, the wrong people will soften, and the whole situation will become easier. But life does not work that way. Truth does not automatically become safe because it is sincere. In the wrong environment, sincerity becomes vulnerability without protection. That is why discernment matters just as much as honesty. You do not owe everyone the deepest explanation of what you feel, what you are building, what you are healing from, what you are deciding, or what you are becoming. Some people have proximity but not depth. Some have history with you but not wisdom. Some have emotional access to you but have never earned informational access to the deeper layers of your life. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them creates a lot of unnecessary suffering. Think about how many times people regret not the truth itself, but the audience. They regret saying it there, to that person, in that stage, under those conditions. That is the lesson. Your truth may be real and still not belong in every room. A clean inner life requires not only courage to speak, but judgment about where speech becomes self-exposure rather than self-respect. Stoicism does not ask you to become false. It asks you to become disciplined, to understand that withholding is not always fear. Sometimes it is wisdom. Sometimes it is protection. Sometimes it is the refusal to hand what is sacred to people who only know how to handle what is convenient. And once you really learn that, the final lesson becomes much easier to live, because when fewer people have access, fewer reactions shape your path, and then your progress can finally become what it was always meant to be. Quiet, consistent, yours. The 10th lesson is this: your progress does not need witnesses, it needs consistency. This is one of the hardest lessons for people living in an age where everything is pushed toward visibility. If something matters, announce it. If something changes, post it. If something begins, explain it. If something is difficult, document it. If something is meaningful, make sure it is seen. But real progress often grows best when it is not constantly being observed, discussed, interpreted, or turned into language before it becomes stable. Because progress does not become stronger when it becomes more visible. It becomes stronger when it becomes more repeatable. This is where many people lose the plot. They become emotionally attached to being seen trying, seen changing, seen evolving, seen becoming disciplined, seen becoming different. And that attachment quietly competes with the actual work. Now the process is no longer just about consistency, it is also about appearance, about being recognized as someone who is changing, about making sure the effort is legible from the outside. And once that happens, the center shifts. The witness becomes part of the motivation. That is unstable. Because what happens when the witness disappears? What happens when no one asks, no one notices, no one validates, no one comments on the discipline, the restraint, the quiet progress, the inner change? A lot of people slow down there, not because the path stopped mattering, but because part of their energy was tied to being seen on the path. And once visibility drops, so does force. Stoicism asks for something more serious than that. It asks whether your standards can survive privacy, whether your effort can continue without applause, whether your discipline still exists when nobody's around to reward it emotionally. That is where consistency becomes real. It is no longer a performance. It becomes character. Think about the difference between a person who talks often about what they are building and a person who keeps building. The first may sound impressive early. The second becomes undeniable later. One uses words to hold the identity in place. The other uses repetition. One needs more witnesses. The other needs fewer interruptions. And over time, life reveals which one was real. This is why quiet consistency is so powerful. It removes the pressure to narrate every step. It frees progress from the burden of being publicly legible. It allows discipline to become private enough that it can deepen without being constantly disturbed by reaction. You stop asking whether people understand what you are doing. You stop needing your path to be affirmed in real time. You just keep going. And that is the point where your life begins to belong to you again. Because once you no longer need witnesses, you become much harder to interrupt, much harder to discourage, much harder to distract. The work gets cleaner, the movement gets steadier, the self gets less theatrical and more grounded, and what once needed explanation starts carrying its own evidence. That is the final freedom behind this whole episode. Not becoming mysterious for the sake of mystery, not becoming silent as an image, but becoming disciplined enough that your life no longer needs constant translation. You let the work speak later. You let consistency prove what words were trying too hard to prove early. And that is where everything starts to change. Because by then, you are no longer asking the world to hold your direction together for you. You are holding it yourself. What changes a life is not always a dramatic act of reinvention. Sometimes it is simply the decision to stop leaking, to stop giving language too early, to stop giving access too freely, to stop spending attention on things that weaken you, to stop feeding gossip, explaining every shift, defending every decision, and making your inner world available to people who have not earned the right to enter it. That is what this episode has really been about. Not silence as image, not privacy as fear, but restraint as power. Because when you stop explaining your life all the time, you begin to see what was really happening before. You were not just communicating, you were scattering yourself, you were weakening momentum. You were inviting noise into places that needed protection. You were making your peace dependent on too many outside reactions. And over time, that dependence becomes exhausting. It steals clarity, it steals force, it steals the quiet authority that comes from living without constant narration. But once you begin living differently, something shifts. You become less available to interruption, less available to misunderstanding, less available to pressure, gossip, and unnecessary access. Your words gain weight because they are no longer cheap. Your attention gains strength because it is no longer leaking. Your boundaries become cleaner. Your silence becomes steadier. Your progress becomes more real because it is no longer being spent on visibility before it becomes stable. And that is where Stoicism becomes practical, not in some distant philosophical way, but in a way that directly changes how you move through ordinary life. You stop feeling the need to explain every decision. You stop turning your private direction into public material. You stop making people comfortable at the cost of your own concentration. And little by little, you begin to recover something a lot of people lose without noticing: inner ownership. So for the next 24 hours, practice one thing. Keep one meaningful part of your life unannounced. No explanation, no update, no defense. Just protect it. Let it remain yours. Then watch what happens to your focus when your energy is no longer being spent on making your path understandable to everyone around you. Because not everything powerful needs to be spoken early. Some things become powerful because they were protected long enough to become real.